It was a damp morning in Bad Thiels, Bavaria, late spring of 1945, when a sealed brown envelope landed on the polished oak desk of General George S. Patton, Jr. The aide who placed it there did not speak. He simply stood at attention, his eyes lowered, because he knew exactly what was inside. The envelope contained the official Inspector General's report on what had happened at Dachau on the morning of April 29, a report that named American soldiers, listed alleged crimes, and demanded courts-martial for men who had liberated the most notorious camp in southern Germany. Patton stared at it for a long moment without moving. Outside, a cold wind rattled the shutters. A clock ticked somewhere down the hall. Patton's jaw tightened. He had read the preliminary briefings. He knew about the boxcars filled with the dead. He knew about the prisoners stacked like firewood. He knew about the SS guards who had been lined up against a coal yard wall and shot. And he knew that somewhere in Washington, men in clean uniforms who had never smelled a corpse were preparing to crush the careers of soldiers who had walked into hell. He picked up the envelope. He weighed it. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned toward the iron stove that warmed his office. What General George S. Patton said in the next 60 seconds, and what he did with that report, would become one of the most quietly buried decisions of the Second World War. To understand why Patton acted the way he did, you have to step backward, 4 months earlier, into the brutal final winter of the war in Europe. The Third Army, his Third Army, had clawed its way across France, smashed through the bulge in a relief drive that no one but Patton believed possible, and was now grinding into the heart of Nazi Germany at a pace that astonished his own staff. By April 1945, Patton's tanks were rolling so fast that supply trucks struggled to keep up. His men were exhausted, filthy, sleep-starved, and increasingly angry. They had seen things in the towns and forests of Germany that would never leave them. Hanged civilians, slave labourers shot in ditches, half-starved children wandering through frozen fields, and the rumours, those terrible rumours, of camps that even hardened combat veterans refused to talk about. Patton himself had heard the rumours for over a year. British intelligence had been forwarding fragmented reports about the camp system since 1943. Polish escapees had spoken of factories that processed human beings like cattle. Soviet liberators of Majdanek had sent photographs westward in the summer of 1944. But nothing in Patton's experience, nothing in any officer's experience, had prepared him for what was about to come tumbling out of the gates of Dachau on the morning of April 29th, 1945. Dachau was not just any camp, it was the original. It had opened in March 1933, only weeks after Hitler took power. For 12 years it had served as the prototype, the laboratory, the training ground for the entire SS concentration camp system. Every camp commandant in Europe had passed through Dachau at some point in his career. By the time the Americans arrived, more than 30,000 prisoners were still alive inside its perimeter, and tens of thousands more lay dead in mass graves, in pits, and in the most horrifying discovery of all, the train. The train had pulled into the rail siding adjacent to the camp days earlier. It contained almost 40 boxcars, packed with prisoners evacuated from another camp called Buchenwald during the chaotic final weeks of the Reich. The journey had taken nearly 3 weeks. There had been no food. There had been no water. SS guards had locked the doors and walked away when the men of the 45th Infantry Division and the 42nd Infantry Division of the United States Army approached Dachau on that cold April morning. The first thing they saw was not the camp itself. It was the train. And what was inside the train would change them forever. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, a tough, lean officer from the 157th Infantry Regiment, was among the first Americans to reach the rail line. He was a battle-hardened veteran who had led men through the Anzio beachhead, through the slaughterhouse of the Vosges, through ice and mud and snipers across the breadth of Europe. He had seen everything war could do to a human body. But when he climbed onto that boxcar and pulled open the sliding door, even Felix Sparks staggered backward. Bodies, stacked. Some still warm. Some twisted in postures that defied comprehension. Children among them. old men with mouths frozen open in their last gasp. Behind him, his men began to vomit, to weep, to curse in voices that were no longer entirely human. One soldier reportedly fell to his knees and could not stand back up. Another fired his rifle into the sky again and again until his magazine was empty. It was within this storm of grief and rage that the soldiers walked into the camp itself. The SS garrison had largely fled the previous night, but a contingent of guards had remained behind, some of them very young, some hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. As the Americans entered, fighting broke out. Some of the SS surrendered. Others tried to disguise themselves in prisoner uniforms. A few attempted to flee through the canals and watchtowers. And then came the moment that would later land on Patton's desk in that brown envelope. In the coal yard against a brick wall, a group of SS guards had been gathered. Accounts differ as to exactly how many were there. Some witnesses said 17, others said dozens. A young American lieutenant ordered them to line up. A machine gunner from one of the platoons set up his weapon. Whether the order to fire came from above, or whether the gunner acted on his own initiative in a moment of overwhelming horror, has been debated for 8 decades. What is undisputed is that the machine gun opened up. SS men crumpled against the wall. Liberated prisoners, watching from inside the barbed wire, allegedly cheered. Some of them rushed forward when the firing stopped and beat the wounded guards to death with shovels, with rocks, with their bare hands. Sparks himself, when he learned what was happening, raced into the yard and physically kicked the gunner away from his weapon, shouting that this was not what the United States Army was here to do. Within hours, more incidents had occurred. Guards captured elsewhere in the camp were shot in 2s and 3s. Prisoners turned on their tormentors with ferocity that frightened even the Americans who had come to free them. By the time order was finally restored, somewhere between 30 and 120 SS personnel lay dead in scenes that resembled neither battle nor execution, but something stranger and darker than both. The army had a problem, a very serious, very public, very politically dangerous problem. The problem travelled up the chain of command with extraordinary speed. Within days, an Inspector General investigation had been launched under the direction of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker. Whitaker was a meticulous, by-the-book officer who took his duties seriously. He interviewed dozens of witnesses, photographed the scenes, collected ballistic evidence from the coal yard wall, and wrote a detailed report running to many pages. His conclusions were direct. American soldiers had killed prisoners of war who had surrendered. Specific officers were named, specific charges were recommended. Courts-martial were proposed. Under the Articles of War of the United States Army, what had occurred at Dachau, regardless of provocation, was a crime. The report worked its way upward through 7th Army to 12th Army Group and finally landed on the desk of the man who held authority over the entire region as the new military governor of Bavaria. That man was George S. Patton. Now here is where you have to understand who Patton was and what kind of moment he was facing. By May 1945, Patton was perhaps the most famous American general alive. The newspapers called him Old Blood and Guts. Hitler had reportedly called him the most dangerous American on the battlefield. His men loved him with an intensity that bordered on religious devotion, even though many of them feared him. He carried ivory-handled revolvers. He wore a polished helmet liner. He had slapped soldiers in Sicily and almost lost his career for it. He had publicly clashed with Eisenhower, with Bradley, with Montgomery, with everyone. He believed, deep in his bones, that he was a reincarnated warrior who had fought in every great army from the Greeks to Napoleon. He was, in short, a man unlike any other in the United States Army of 1945. And he was about to make a decision that would never appear in any history textbook, but which would echo quietly through the next century. Patton did not act immediately. He read the report carefully. He was not careless about discipline. In fact, throughout the war he had been famous, even infamous, for enforcing strict standards on his men. He had personally chewed out soldiers for unshaved faces, for unbuttoned collars, for sloppy salutes. He had relieved officers without hesitation when they failed him. He believed in discipline as fiercely as anyone in uniform. So when this particular report reached his hands, he did not dismiss it casually. He did something more deliberate, something stranger, and something more revealing of the man he was. He went to Dachau. Personally, with only a small staff escort, he drove the dusty miles from Bad Tiels to the camp itself, walked through the gates, and saw with his own eyes what his men had seen on the morning of April 29. Witnesses described his face afterward as grey, set, almost stone-like. He did not speak much during the visit. He paused at the boxcars on the rail siding, which had still not been entirely cleared. He looked into the crematorium ovens. He stood in the coal yard, where the marks of the machine gun bullets were still visible on the brick wall. He turned, slowly, taking in the entire scene. And then he walked back to his car without a word. Back at his headquarters, he summoned a small group of his most trusted officers. The conversation that followed has never been fully reconstructed in any official document, because no transcript was ever made. But fragments of it survived in private diaries, in post-war letters, and in the memories of men who were there. According to those accounts, Patton spoke quietly at first, which was unusual for him. He asked his officers what they would have done if they had been the first to open those boxcars. He asked them what they would have done if they had walked through the barracks and seen prisoners so emaciated that they weighed less than a child. He asked them what they would have done if a captured SS guard had spat at them, laughed at them, denied any wrongdoing, demanded the rights of a prisoner of war under the Geneva Convention. The room, by all accounts, was silent. Then, Patton's voice rose. He said that he had been a soldier his entire life. He said that he had killed men with his own hands. He said that he understood what combat did to a man's mind. He said that he had read every word of Whitaker's report and that the legal case was, on paper, solid. By the strict letter of the Articles of War, courts-martial were warranted. Convictions, in some cases, were likely. Sentences could include long imprisonments, dishonourable discharges, even in theory executions. He acknowledged all of this. And then he said the words that would later become the most quietly explosive sentence of his governorship of Bavaria. He said that he would be damned if he would court-martial American soldiers for what they had done at Dachau. The exact phrasing varies in different memoirs. One version remembered him saying that any American who could walk into Dachau and not kill a guard was not a man he wanted in his army. Another version recalled him saying that he would burn the report before he would burn the careers of those boys. A third version, told decades later by a junior officer who had been in the room, recounted Patton turning toward the iron stove in the corner, opening the door and feeding the documents in one by one. The flames, that officer remembered, lit Patton's face from below, casting shadows that made him look older than his 60 years. He did not seem triumphant. He did not seem angry. He looked, the officer said, simply tired. Whether the report was literally burned, or whether Patton merely buried it administratively in a drawer that never opened again, remains one of the small, unsolved mysteries of the post-war occupation. What is certain, what is documented in the actual paper trail, is that no American soldier was ever court-martialed for the killings at Dachau. The Inspector General's investigation, which had moved with such speed and seriousness in the spring of 1945, simply went silent. The recommendations vanished. The charges evaporated. The men who had pulled triggers in the coal yard returned home to their farms and factories and small towns and lived the rest of their lives without a single official mark against their service records. But Patton did not act alone, and he did not act in a vacuum. His decision, however informally made, had to be coordinated upward. There is fragmentary evidence that he discussed the matter directly with Eisenhower, although the two men by that point had grown apart in ways that would soon become a public rift. Eisenhower, who had himself walked through the camp at Ohrdruf earlier that month and emerged shaken to his core, had famously ordered American troops to view the camps so that, in his own words, no one in future generations could deny what had happened. Eisenhower understood the moral weight of what had been uncovered. He understood the political weight as well. A series of high-profile courts-martial of American liberators in the immediate aftermath of victory would have been a catastrophe. Not just for the Army's reputation, but for the entire Allied narrative of the war. Patton's decision, in this sense, was not merely a personal act of mercy or rage. It was, whether intentionally or not, a strategic act that protected something larger than the men in the coal yard. It protected the meaning of the war itself. Yet there was something distinctly Patton about the way he handled it. Eisenhower, had he received the report directly, would likely have processed it through proper channels, allowed the legal machinery to grind for months, and produced some kind of formal but quiet outcome. Patton was incapable of that kind of patience. He believed in direct action. He believed in trusting his instinct. He believed, perhaps above all, that there were moments in life when the law and the truth diverged, and that a real soldier had to choose the truth. This was not the first time Patton had done something like this. Throughout the war, his style of command had been characterized by a willingness to cut through bureaucracy when he believed bureaucracy was getting in the way of justice or victory. He had bent rules about supply allocations. He had ignored boundary lines drawn by other commanders. He had pushed his army into territories he was technically forbidden from entering. He had, more than once, made decisions that historians would later call brilliant or reckless or both. The Deco decision fit into this pattern. It was Patton being Patton, a man who trusted his own moral compass more than he trusted any document. And yet there was something different about this one. Most of Patton's bureaucratic violations had been in the service of military aggression, of pushing forward, of attacking. This decision was the opposite. It was a decision to hold back the machinery of justice, to let something rest, to allow a buried thing to remain buried. It was, in a sense, the most uncharacteristic decision Patton ever made. And it may also have been the most human. The question that historians have asked ever since is whether Patton was right. The answer is not simple. From a strictly legal standpoint, what occurred at Dachau on April 29, 1945, was a violation of the laws of war. Surrendered combatants are not to be killed. This principle is fundamental to military law and to civilization itself. The argument against summary executions of even the worst criminals is that once that line is crossed, the army crosses it again and again, and the moral distinction between the liberators and the perpetrators begins to blur. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks understood this. That is why he had physically attacked his own machine gunner in the coal yard. That is why he had reported the incident upward in the first place. He was not a man who believed in vengeance disguised as justice. But there is another argument, an older argument, one that goes back to the earliest reflections on what war really is. That argument holds that there are moments in human history so monstrous, so far beyond ordinary categories, that the conventional rules cannot be applied without doing violence to a deeper kind of justice. The men who walked into Dachau on April 29 were not committing premeditated murder. They were responding, in the heat of an unimaginable moment, to evidence of a crime so vast that the normal frameworks of law and order trembled. To prosecute them as ordinary murderers, the argument goes, would have been to treat the SS guards as ordinary victims and the camp as an ordinary place. It would have been to flatten the moral landscape of what the war had really been about. Patton, in his own rough and unphilosophical way, seems to have grasped this. He may not have articulated it in elegant language, but he understood it in his gut. And he acted accordingly. The aftermath of his decision is also worth considering carefully. The men who had killed at Dachau did not, by all available evidence, become hardened killers. They went home. They worked in shipyards and on assembly lines and in classrooms. They raised children. They attended church on Sundays. Some of them spoke about what they had seen. Most of them did not. Sparks himself, the colonel who had tried to stop the worst of the killings, lived a long life and eventually returned to Dachau decades later as a guest of the Bavarian government, where he stood once again in the coal yard and wept openly. He never publicly criticised Patton's decision. He was, perhaps, grateful for it. The men who had been spared courts-martial owed Patton their futures. Most of them never knew it. The decision was made so quietly, so deliberately, so far above their pay grade, that they returned to civilian life with no idea that their general had stood between them and the prosecutorial machinery of the United States Army. They thought, perhaps, that the system had simply forgotten about them, or that the chaos of the war's end had buried their actions in paperwork. They never imagined that one man, alone in his office in Bad Teals, had read the report, weighed the consequences, and chosen to make it disappear. Patton's tenure as military governor of Bavaria did not last long after this episode. Within months, he was embroiled in a different controversy. This one involving comments he made to journalists about denazification and his apparent reluctance to remove former Nazi Party members from German civil administrative positions. Eisenhower, fed up, removed him from his command of the Third Army and reassigned him to the 15th Army, a paper command focused on writing the historical record of the war. It was, in effect, a demotion. Patton was furious. He fumed. He raged. He told confidants that he was being silenced for telling the truth. By the autumn of 1945, the great lion of American arms was a frustrated, increasingly bitter man, separated from the soldiers he had loved, sidelined from the post-war reconstruction he had hoped to influence. And then, on December 9th, 1945, came the car accident on a quiet road outside of Mannheim. A truck made a turn. Patton's staff car swerved. He was thrown forward and broke his neck. He lay paralyzed in a hospital in Heidelberg for 12 days, calmly preparing himself for death. He died on December 21st, 1945. He never wrote a memoir. He never gave the major public account of his post-war governorship that he had clearly been preparing in his head. The full story of what he had done with the Dachau report, in his own words, was never told. This is why the matter has lingered in the shadow of history rather than at its centre. The men who knew were few. The men who could speak were fewer. By the time historians began to take serious interest in the Dachau reprisals in the 1980s and 1990s, most of the principals were dead. Felix Sparks lived until 2007 and gave a number of detailed interviews late in life in which he discussed the killings with sober honesty. He acknowledged that what had happened was wrong by the strict standards of military law. He also acknowledged that he understood why it had happened and that he held no grudge against the men involved, including the machine gunner he had personally kicked away from his weapon. As for Patton's role in shielding everyone from prosecution, Sparks discussed it with a kind of grim respect. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves to be examined carefully, because it speaks to something deep about Patton himself. Throughout his career, Patton had been famous for his apparent love of war and his eagerness to fight. His speeches, his profanity, his theatrical bravado all painted a picture of a man who relished combat in an almost primitive way. But beneath that public persona was a more complicated figure. Patton wrote poetry. He read history voraciously. He was a deeply religious man in his own idiosyncratic way. He kept journals filled with reflections on courage and duty and the meaning of suffering. The Deco decision fits into this hidden side of Patton far more than it fits into the cartoon version. It was not the act of a man who loved violence. It was the act of a man who understood profoundly what violence does to a soul, and who could not bring himself to add to that suffering by destroying the lives of soldiers who had already seen too much. The question of how to weigh this decision morally, finally, may be unanswerable. Reasonable people examining the same facts can reach different conclusions. The strict moralist will say that Patton subverted military justice, that the rule of law must apply even in the most extreme circumstances, that the killings at Deco, however understandable, were crimes that should have been prosecuted as a matter of principle. The contextualist will say that Patton recognised something essential about the moment he was in, that he understood the difference between vengeance and justice, that he made a decision that prioritised the long-term healing of his men over the abstract demands of a code that had not been written. With such horrors in mind, both positions have weight. Both deserve to be taken seriously. What cannot be denied is that Patton made the call, and that the call has held for 80 years. There is one final detail that has surfaced from the fragmented accounts of those who were present at the various meetings where Patton discussed the matter. According to one of his aides, the general was alone in his office on the evening that the final disposition of the case was made. He had drafted a brief, unofficial memorandum that summarized his decision in a few terse sentences. He had not yet decided whether to file it, destroy it, or send it upward. The aide entered the office to deliver an unrelated message and found Patton sitting at his desk, the memorandum in his hands, looking out the window at the gathering dusk. Patton did not turn around. He did not acknowledge the aide's presence for a long moment. Then, without looking, he spoke. His voice was low and rough, the way it always got when he was tired or thinking deeply. He said something that the aide remembered for the rest of his life. He said that he had been thinking about all the men under his command who had died in the campaign across Europe. He said he had been thinking about the boys at Bastogne, and the boys in the Ardennes, and the boys in every burned-out village from Normandy to the Rhine. And then, he said that he had decided that he would not, under any circumstances, allow the United States Army to put the boys who liberated Dachau on trial. Not while he had any breath left in his body. Not while he had any authority left to wield. Not for what they had done in that coal yard, or in that camp, or anywhere else within the gates of Dachau on April 29th, 1945. He said it quietly. He said it without rage. He said it as if it were the most obvious decision in the world. And then he placed the memorandum face down on his desk and asked the aide to bring him a cup of coffee. That cup of coffee, the aide later recalled, was the last conversation he ever had with Patton about the matter. The general never raised the subject again. The memorandum was never seen by anyone outside that office. It either burned in the iron stove, as the legend has it, or vanished into a private file that has never been recovered. The Inspector General's report, the original document drafted by Lieutenant Colonel Whitaker, did survive, and portions of it eventually became available to historians through the National Archives. But no formal action was ever taken. No soldier was ever charged. No officer was ever reduced in rank. The story, as far as the official record was concerned, simply ended. What Patton said when asked to court-martial the soldiers who killed SS guards was, in essence, no. He said it not in a single dramatic phrase suitable for a movie poster, but in a long, deliberate, deeply considered act of moral judgment that played out over weeks of meetings, drives to the camp, late-night conversations with trusted officers, and finally, perhaps, in the quiet act of feeding a report to the flames. He said no to the prosecutorial machinery. He said no to the political convenience that might have come from a few showcase trials.